Phoenix doesn't forgive the slow or the soft. I drove a garbage truck through the city's oven heat, past houses that pretended their secrets melted in the sun. One morning, on a route I could drive blindfolded, I found a way to lift $6.2 million from a cartel that thought it owned every shadow in this town. I did it for love, for a debt that had my throat in a vice, for the kind of hope that only shows up when you're out of options. What followed was a week where the air tasted like hot metal and lies, where friends turned into mirrors I didn't recognize, where a woman I trusted kept a truth sharp enough to cut me in half, and where a hunter with a badge learned he liked the feeling of being paid to look away. I learned what disappears first when you decide to steal your way out of the life you think is killing you: your name, then your sleep, then every piece of yourself you swore would never be for sale. This is a story of ordinary routines becoming a weapon, of love that arrives like water and leaves like gasoline, of a fight fought behind steering wheels and loading docks, of a victory that tasted like ash even as it saved the only heart I couldn't afford to lose. By the end, a driver in Phoenix vanished. Whether that was a tragedy, a miracle, or just the cleanest thing I ever did, well, that depends on how you count the dead and the living. If you want the whole truth, the kind that burns going down, stick with me to the end and consider subscribing so you don't miss how a man can steal a fortune and still end up owing everything. The first proof that I was already gone came a week before I disappeared, when the monsoon clouds stalled over Phoenix and refused to break, and the city felt like it was holding its breath with a fist. I woke in the one-bedroom off 27th Avenue, sheets damp, ceiling fan pushing hot air in a circle that never seemed to complete, and I understood that an ordinary life can make you vanish long before anyone notices you're missing. My alarm said 3:42 a.m., the hour when the city's lies were still cooling on the pavement and the trash behind to carry us and payday lenders hummed softly like sleeping dogs. I dressed without turning on the light, counted cash twice like a rosary, and told myself the number didn't matter because numbers were only symptoms and I needed a cure. The truck coughed awake in the yard off Buckeye, a battered green box with a temperamental hydraulics hiss that sounded like someone shushing a confession. I had a route I could drive blind, a beat carved into me by routine: South Phoenix, Warehouse Rows, cinderblock apartments where the dumpsters were held shut with bungee cords and hope, gated communities where the bins smelled like citrus rinds and chlorine, and a stretch of old industrial lots where the city handed off its memory to dust. I loved the route the way a boxer loves scar tissue, proof that I could take what the day threw and keep moving. The job taught me that people throw away more than leftovers. They toss out letters they shouldn't have opened, photos where someone's eyes told the truth too early, broken gifts that outlive their apologies, and sometimes things that are not supposed to be seen by anyone who isn't being paid to guard them. I learned the rhythms of disappearance. Mondays were light, Fridays were heavy with weekend lies, and the first of the month tasted like stale fear when rent came due. By year 5, you develop a sense for what's inside a bag by how it sags. By year 8, you can read a neighborhood by the way the bins line up at the curb. At 10, you start to hear the city speak through the tailgate rattle, and if you listen too closely, you begin answering back. I had a reason to listen. Her name lived behind my teeth like a secret I could chew on when the day got mean. She moved through my apartment like she owned the air, and maybe she did, because when she breathed easy, I did too. We met the year the hospital said her little brother's blood was waging a war it wasn't meant to win. Insurance did what insurance does, which is smile politely while it measures how much of your life it can legally take. I learned the always late math of copays and experimental treatments and flights to Houston, where hope came in refrigerated boxes. I learned the look a woman wears when she wants to believe in you even while her hands know the size of your pockets. I learned that love is not the opposite of debt. Sometimes it is the collateral. The first time I saw the stash, it wasn't a movie moment. No gold glow, no choir. Just a cold pre-dawn behind a welding shop that rented its back lot to truckers who preferred not to be seen. The city had forgotten that stretch. The streetlights blinked as if embarrassed to be there, and the smell was a mix of burned metal and desert rain that wouldn't fall. There was a new dumpster, unregistered, the kind the company never logged because it belonged to a cash side arrangement that looked minor until you touched it and realized the edges cut deep. It sat too far from the service gate, as if it wanted room to breathe, and 2 days a week a white panel van with stolen plates would idle there like a man whistling while he lies. I learned to look without looking. The men with the van didn't dress like men who load trash. Their boots were wrong, their eyes kept counting, and their hands didn't have the small nicks you earn moving other people's shame. They lifted tightly wrapped bricks the size of family Bibles, then covered them with clear contractor bags filled with restaurant waste. The trick smelled simple: layer the grotesque over the valuable and hope no one wants to get their hands dirty. I told myself it was none of my business and drove on, because refusing a story is another way to survive it. Then the yard manager assigned me a relief shift on a rival's route, and the map put me back at that welding shop on a Tuesday, the wrong day, the day the men in the van weren't supposed to be there. But they were, and something had changed. They were nervous in a way that makes even the air fidget. One kept glancing at the lot's far fence where a roll of razor wire had been patched recently, not by the owner, but by a hand that didn't know what it was doing. The dumpster lid hung slightly ajar as if it had breathed out and hadn't remembered to inhale. I told myself I shouldn't look, which is exactly how you end up looking. The first surprise was not what was inside, but what was missing. No waste bags, no camouflage. Just space, grinning in the dark like a tooth knocked out the night before. The second surprise was what my hands did without asking me. They tested the rear hatch, found it sticky like it always was when the air weighed too much, and coaxed it into opening. The third was the realization that the men were watching me not to see what I would take, but to confirm I would leave it alone. There's a power in being expected to be invisible. It is a kind of permission. I worked the lever, the pistons complained, and I thought about the letter from the hospital that had arrived the previous afternoon, the one with numbers that turned my stomach sour and my future into a narrow hallway with no exits. I thought about the plastic smile of the banker who had said there were always options and then handed me a pamphlet that felt like a dare. I thought about love like a faucet you can't turn off and grief like the bucket you keep trying to fill beneath it. The fourth surprise, if that's even the right word for it, was the box. It was too clean and too dry in a place that had no business being either. Heavy in a way that told a truth my head didn't want, but my bones already knew. When the compactor pulled it toward me, the corner taped in brown split, and what looked like cash yawned out, lazy in the heat. Not the rubber-banded 20s you see in gas station registers. Hundreds. The color of unripe limes under old fluorescent light. I felt the old arguments begin, the ones you rehearse when you want to pretend your decisions are the result of a debate and not a hunger. This is bait, I told myself. This is a test. This is a camera. This is doom. And then the voice that had been learning to speak inside me all summer, the one that sounded like a man who'd run out of every brand of pride except the kind that helps you lift, said something simpler. This is the door. I can dress it up, but the fact is that I didn't take anything that day. I needed to know how many doors there were and where each one opened before I walked through any of them. I closed the hatch, finished the street, and kept my mouth shut around my coworkers because in Phoenix gossip travels like fire on oily rags. But that night I did not sleep. I lay there listening to the fan lift and dropped the same breath over and over and made the kind of plan you make when the future has stopped negotiating with you. I mapped the route down to seconds, learned the cycles of the lot's cameras, watched the sky to predict the monsoon's distraction, charted the supervisor's smoke breaks, and fed the secret on a diet of discipline because that's how a bad idea gains muscle. I told myself I was borrowing from people who had borrowed worse, that I would pay the universe back with interest, that I wasn't stealing so much as correcting the balance on a scale that had been rigged long before I learned to count. It felt like prayer and tasted like rust. A week before I disappeared, Phoenix finally exhaled. The first hard rain came down in a sheet, and everyone in the yard looked up as if God had remembered our address. Water pounded the truck's roof like impatient knuckles. The world smelled briefly clean. On the cracked asphalt, oil lifted in rainbow skins and slid toward the drains. When I pulled out onto the street, the clouds sat so low I could feel the cool leak through the seams of the cab. The city moved slower, sirens lazily combed the distance, and for once the heat didn't argue with every decision. I watched the welding shop slot slide into frame and knew the door I had chosen was finally open, and if I didn't walk through now, it would shut in a way that didn't just bruise but erased. I wasn't brave and I wasn't noble. I was a man whose life had become a ledger and who had finally spotted a line item labeled mercy. I gripped the wheel and didn't blink. The first rule of stealing from men who kill for less is silence. Silence in your body, in your face, in the sound your boots make when they hit the ground. I told myself that as I rolled the truck back into the welding lot on the storm's second night. The rain had cooled the desert just enough that steam rose from the asphalt like ghosts shaking off sleep. Headlights broke against the fence and the razor wire looked wet and hungry. I had rehearsed the moment 100 times in my head, and yet standing there, hands tight on the wheel, I knew rehearsal was a lie. Nothing prepares you for betrayal, especially when the betrayal is your own. The dumpster waited, swollen at the hinges, its metal belly groaning with the weight of something that wanted out. I moved like a man dragging his shadow, slow, deliberate, half praying the storm would keep anyone else away. The city's sirens sounded distant, like lullabies for men who'd lost their mothers too soon. When I hit the lever, the hydraulic scream rose above the rain, a sound so sharp it felt like it cut the night in two. The lid rose and the box showed itself, same as before, same tape, same promise. Only this time I didn't look away. I pulled it toward me, and for a second I thought the rain was disguising my heartbeat, but the truth is nothing disguises fear. It's an odor, an aura, a song everyone nearby already knows the words to. The box tore at the corner and more bills spilled out, stubborn in their neat stacks. $6.2 million is heavy in ways you don't measure by pounds. It presses on your lungs, on your conscience, on the edges of every decision you thought you'd never have to make. I told myself to load it fast, to bury it beneath the day's haul, to let the stench of spoiled meat and bleach mask the scent of ambition. And I did. My hands worked with the calm of a surgeon who knows hesitation kills. The money disappeared under refuse, under the waste of lives that couldn't afford to be careful. When I pulled out of the lot, the rain clung to the windshield like it wanted to hold me back, but the wipers slapped it aside with mechanical indifference. That was the easy part. The hard part came 3 blocks later, when headlights locked onto my rear view and refused to let go. A black SUV, tinted so dark it looked like absence itself, kept distance for a while, then closed the gap as if it were reminding me that even the dark has eyes. My throat dried as if the storm had skipped me. I took corners sharper than usual, tested whether the SUV matched my moves. It did, until it didn't. At an intersection, it idled just long enough for me to doubt myself, then peeled away into the night like it had never been interested at all. But doubt once planted grows fast. By the time I reached the yard and parked the truck, sweat had soaked my shirt. The box still sat beneath the layers of trash, patient, breathing with me. The routine came next, and routine is salvation. I clocked out. I nodded at a coworker whose name I had never bothered to remember. I walked to the apartment where she was waiting. She looked up from the couch, eyes tired but sharp, and asked why I was late. I lied, and the lie slid too easily off my tongue. That's when I understood. The theft had already started to hollow me. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark, ears straining for footsteps on the stairs, for a knock that would split the night, for the thunder of a door kicked in. Instead came silence, and silence is worse because it forces you to listen to your own thoughts. What I had done wasn't just theft. It was a declaration. The cartel would come looking. The police, if they caught a whiff, would come sniffing. And she would start noticing the weight in my eyes, the hesitation in my touch. Love demands honesty, but debt teaches lies. By dawn, I knew 2 things. 1, there was no going back. 2, disappearance was no longer a choice. It was the only future I could buy. The money didn't feel real until it touched the apartment air. I hauled the box up 3 flights with my pulse hammering in my throat and set it down in the dark kitchen where the fridge hummed like it knew a secret. I sliced the tape with a paring knife, and the smell that rose wasn't paper or ink. It was power, raw and metallic, the kind of scent you imagine clings to vaults. Stacks of hundreds, so tight they held the shape of the box, stared back at me. The weight of it bent the table, and for a moment I thought the wood might snap. which felt like a warning. She was asleep in the bedroom, her breathing steady, her hair spread across the pillow like a map of every road I'd failed to take. I watched her chest rise and fall, and for a second I believed the money could make that rhythm permanent, that it could buy back years the doctors said were slipping away. Love is cruel that way. It convinces you theft is devotion. By dawn, paranoia became my breakfast. Every knock at the neighbor's door rattled like it was meant for me. Every siren in the distance carried my name in its pitch. I wrapped the cash in garbage bags, ironic as hell, and stuffed them in the hollow behind the water heater where cockroaches had ruled unchallenged for years. They scattered like witnesses who knew better than to testify. Hiding it wasn't enough. I needed to move it, launder it, turn it into something unremarkable. But those were thoughts for another day. That morning, the thought was survival. And survival meant showing up for work as if nothing had changed, as if I hadn't driven a knife into the cartel's chest and stolen the blood they pumped across the border. At the yard, faces looked normal, but normal as a costume. A coworker mentioned a rumor, a story about a shipment gone missing, about men with hard eyes asking questions in a mix of Spanish and silence. He laughed when he said it, but the laugh was wrong. It sounded rehearsed, brittle. I knew then that the circle was already tightening. The cartel wasn't asking who. They were asking how quickly they could make an example. And examples in their business are always loud. That night, I told her I was working late. She didn't argue, didn't even look up from the hospital forms spread like a battlefield across the table. Guilt bent me in half, but I left anyway. I drove to the desert's edge, where the city's glow ended and the stars resumed their rule. I dug with my hands until the skin split and shoved a portion of the cash into the earth, the bills sealed in plastic, the hole shallow and desperate. As I covered it, I realized I wasn't burying money. I was planting fear, and fear grows faster than anything else in Arizona soil. When I got home, the apartment lights were off. She sat in the dark, eyes catching what little glow leaked in from the parking lot. She asked me what I was hiding. I opened my mouth, but the silence that came out said everything. That's when I knew the cartel wasn't the only one I had to survive. Trust rots from the inside. You don't notice it until the smell fills the room and you can't breathe without tasting betrayal. 2 nights after I buried the first bundle, she started watching me differently, as if my shadow moved before I did. She asked about my routes, my overtime, my sudden silences. I gave her half-truths, which are worse than lies because they come dressed like honesty. She nodded, but her eyes said she was already storing ammunition for the moment she needed to pull the trigger. That same week, the SUV returned. Not once, not twice, 3 times. Always behind me, always just far enough to pretend it wasn't following. The windows black, the tires chewing pavement like they were hungry for blood. I told myself it was paranoia, but paranoia doesn't idle outside your apartment at 2 a.m. with the engine humming like a threat. I stayed inside, lights off, holding a wrench I knew wouldn't save me. The money weighed heavier each day, not in pounds, but in suspicion. Every coworker's glance lingered too long. The foreman asked casual questions with the rhythm of a man taking notes for someone else. Even the dispatcher's laugh felt like a test. Cartel fear seeps fast. It makes civilians into informants without them knowing. Then came the cop. A detective, maybe, though the badge he flashed looked tired, like it had been bought secondhand. He found me behind a truck after a shift, his handshake too firm, his smile too friendly. He asked about missing shipments, about whether I'd seen anything unusual. His eyes were calm, but calm like a snake basking before the strike. I lied again, said I only hauled what the city threw away. He leaned close, voice soft as a prayer, and told me sometimes men like him were paid to look away, but only if they liked who they were looking away from. I didn't answer. He left, but the message stayed. I was in play now, a pawn offered to both sides. At home, she finally broke. She slammed the hospital forms onto the table, demanded to know where the money would come from. I opened my mouth, ready to confess, ready to damn myself with the truth. But instead, I told her I was working double shifts, that I was saving, that miracles don't always come with wings. Her shoulders sagged, and in that moment I hated myself more than the cartel ever could. Love deserved better than lies, but lies were all I had left to give. That night, I sat with the box, the stacks staring like witnesses. I counted them until the numbers blurred, until they became just shapes, until they stopped meaning salvation and started looking like gravestones. The question wasn't whether the cartel would come. The question was when, and whether I'd still have enough of myself left to fight. Disappearance isn't sudden. It starts in fragments. First, you stop answering calls from friends who never knew you well enough to suspect the silence. Then you change routes, eat at places where no one remembers your face, stop going to the bar where your name is etched into the wood. You erase yourself in pieces until the only thing left is the outline of a man the city once thought it knew. I spent my nights moving money in smaller portions, spreading it across hiding spots like seeds that would never sprout. Desert holes, storage lockers under false names, the false bottom of a rusted toolbox in the yard. Every hiding place became both sanctuary and death sentence because I knew I'd never be able to return to them all. Meanwhile, the SUV grew bolder. One morning it cut me off at a red light, pausing just long enough for the passenger window to roll down. I braced for the gun, for the flash, for the end. But nothing came. Just a smile, quick and sharp, before the glass slid back up and the vehicle roared away. They wanted me to know they weren't hunting. They were waiting for me to run. At home, she found one of the smaller bundles. I came back to the apartment and saw her sitting on the couch, the cash in her lap like it had been dropped there by a god she didn't believe in. Her eyes carried fire and fear in equal measure. She asked me whose blood I had taken to get it. I tried to explain, tried to make theft sound like salvation, but she cut through every word with one truth. We were already dead if the money was real. That night, she packed a bag. Not all of it, not enough to mean goodbye, but enough to remind me that love has a breaking point. I didn't stop her, because part of me knew she was right. The city had grown louder. Sirens sang every night, though maybe they were only in my head. The detective reappeared, no badge this time, just casual clothes and a warning. He told me the cartel didn't forgive, that I was living on borrowed hours. But he also hinted at an escape, a way to trade silence for survival. He wanted a cut, of course. Everyone does when the air smells like blood and bills. I didn't answer him then. But later, lying awake, I thought about what kind of man trades pieces of himself until there's nothing left but a ghost. The truth settled heavy on me. I already had. The end began on a Tuesday. Always a Tuesday, the day the city feels emptiest, like everyone is waiting for something bad to arrive. I woke to silence that felt wrong. She was gone, her side of the bed cold, her bag missing. On the table, one sheet of paper, no goodbye, no apology, just the hospital bill with a circle around the total and nothing else. That was her farewell. Outside, the SUV waited. Not hiding anymore, not pretending. Two men leaned against it, smoking, their eyes on my door. They didn't rush. Predators never rush when they know the prey is cornered. I stayed inside, counting the money like it could answer a question I hadn't asked. How much is a life worth when it's already half spent? By dusk, the detective came back. No badge, no pretense, just hunger. He offered me a deal, half the money, and he'd make sure the cartel's eyes looked elsewhere. I stared at him and realized there was no difference between him and the men outside. Everyone in Phoenix had a price, and mine was already marked in red ink. That night, I loaded the truck one last time. Not for work, this was my exit. I stuffed the compartments with what cash I could, left the rest buried in earth that would never forgive me, and drove. The city blurred into desert, the desert into black road, and still the SUV followed. Headlights behind me unwavering. I pushed harder, the engine howling, the truck rattling like it might shake itself apart. Somewhere outside Phoenix, the rain returned, hammering down, drowning the sound of pursuit for one blessed moment. I turned off my lights, veered onto a dirt road, let the storm swallow me whole. When I stopped, when the engine finally gave its last cough, I stepped out into mud and lightning and realized I had vanished. No witnesses, no trace, no name left worth saying. The money was mine, but so was the silence. And silence, I learned too late, is just another kind of cage. I used to think disappearance meant the world lost sight of you in some dramatic instant. A siren-choked chase, a violent break, a body no one could claim. But the truth is softer, stranger, more stubborn. It happens the way rust eats a bolt, slow, hungry, and inevitable once the air learns what to do with you. The storm carried me off the road and into a wash that the city left unguarded because it only remembers water when it's drowning in it. I cut the engine and let the truck's heat fade until the cab felt like the inside of a closed fist. The SUV prowled past on the main road, patient as a mortgage, and the lightning stitched brief white bones into the sky. I had what was left of the money split into three bodies: the truck's hollow panels, a duffel taped into the seat frame, and a package from a lawyer who didn't ask questions because men like me are the only clients who pay his rent on time. I wasn't running toward safety. I was aiming at a story that could survive without me. The detective had asked for a midnight meet on the edge of the landfill, that sleeping mountain where the city keeps everything it swears it's done with. He wanted his cut, and he wanted me pliant, and he would bring a story he could tell later about how he'd tried to save me. I said yes because I needed 3 sets of eyes focused on one place while I walked into another. The cartel would be there, men who treated fear like currency, men who believed trash was only what they hadn't learned to sell yet. I drove the last mile with the lights off and the storm doing me the kind favor of erasing my tracks. The landfill after rain smells like a lie, bright, chemical, alive in the wrong ways. The flare stacks hissed like they were shushing the night. I parked near a row of dead excavators and watched the 3 cars assembled below, the detectives unmarked, the SUV I'd come to know like a tumor, and a third sedan with Sonoran plates that had probably crossed through the checkpoint with a smile and a promise. If this were a clean story, I would say I outfoxed them, that my plan was elegant, that I threaded a needle between men who believed they were the cloth. But the truth is uglier. The detective tried to sell me to the cartel, and the cartel tried to buy him for less than he thought he was worth, and pride did the rest. Voices rose, hands twitched. Someone's need to be the cleverest man in the dark arrived late and too loud. The first shot knocked a bird out of the night, and the second shot found the wrong car door, and the rest folded over themselves like dominoes convinced they were kings. I didn't fire a gun. I didn't have to. I had brought a storm and a place designed to eat what the city didn't want to see, and between those two, the night did my work. When the SUV finally screamed away with 2 bodies and a promise to return with more, the detective's car remained, idling, its driver slumped in a posture that meant his future had shrunk to a single point. He was still breathing. He would live long enough to tell a new story to a new master. I left the wash the way men leave church when they've done their bargaining and decided God can collect later. 2 hours before dawn, I walked into a 24-hour shipping office that sells privacy by the pound and pushed across the counter a package addressed to a hospital foundation in Houston with a memo line that said, "In memory of what we could not afford." I had taken the cash from the seat-frame duffel and converted it into the respectable shape of a cashier's check because respectability is a costume money buys when it wants to pretend it was earned. The clerk stamped it, slid me a receipt I would never keep, and yawned like redemption was just another package moving through his hands. I mailed 2 more parcels, one to a landlord who had never fixed the heat but had always pretended to ask about my day, with 3 months' rent and a note that said, "Let her break the lease without a fee," and one to a post office box I'd opened months earlier under a name I'd worn once in high school, when I thought reinvention was a haircut and a better shirt. Inside that last parcel, enough to be the skeleton of a life somewhere far from asphalt that sizzles when it rains. The woman I loved deserved more than a vanishing act, but a vanishing act was the only thing that might save her. I couldn't give her safety by staying, and I couldn't give her truth without painting a target on her back so bright the night would never sleep again. So I gave her distance. The foundation would call and tell her a miracle had arrived under the kind of donor name that makes accountants smile and nurses weep, and she would know, because she was the only one who had ever known the shape of my silence. She would curse me and bless me in the same breath, and both would be fair. What remained of the money had work to do that I couldn't supervise. Phoenix was waking as I walked the last stretch to the yard, sky breaking into a gray that never looks like hope until you've survived to see it again. The trucks looked like beasts at rest. I opened the cab of one assigned to a driver who showed up late as a religion and lay down across the seats with my jacket over my face like a makeshift shroud. When the engine kicked over and the route began, I rode in the belly of the day one last time, a passenger in the routine that had built me and then taught me how to unbuild myself. At a stop behind a strip mall where the dumpsters carried secrets in the hinges, I slipped out, head down, vest on, just another worker stepping into the heat. I crossed the alley and kept walking until the city's noises rearranged into a language that didn't include my name. There are versions of this ending where I end up in Alaska, where cold air teaches my lungs a new honesty and my hands find a different will to hold. There are versions where I pour coffee in a town that thinks Phoenix is a myth and I listen to strangers complain about weather that never tries to kill them. There are versions where the cartel finds me anyway. Because men who inventory fear for a living don't respect geography. All those versions are true and none are. What matters is this. In Phoenix, they never saw me again. Not the man with the SUV, not the detective who discovered he liked the taste of his own blood more than he'd expected, not the foreman who had already started practicing the shrug he'd give reporters, not the clerk who yawned through my penance and cashed his check and forgot my face before I hit the door. The city kept breathing, the route went on, and a hospital far away spent money that arrived like rain on a day the sky had promised to stay shut. Love is a debt that doesn't cancel. It just changes shape. Mine changed into absence and interest and a little mercy disguised as cruelty. If you're looking for victory, maybe it's this. I stole from men who thought they owned every shadow and used their money to buy a little light. If you're counting the dead and the living, count me wherever you need to make the story add up. And if you want more endings like this, the kind that sink their teeth in and don't let go, hit like and subscribe. Stay with me for the next time the heat hums, the lies hiss, and a man chooses the door that costs him his name.